Thank you very much, and I have to begin by apologising for lateness and saying thanks to the first speaker who swapped around flexibly. And can I just actually second your recommendation of Anna Minter's book? It's absolutely brilliant, and I'm really sorry I didn't get the chance to hear your talk, but I think it sounded great, the piece that I caught. It is actually lovely to be back with the International Symposium on Cultural Democracy and Diplomacy in the Commonwealth. I was actually just reflecting on 2 years ago I spoke at this event for the first time, and it was just when Nigel Farage, the leader of the UK Independence Party, UKIP, was becoming prominent, and it was actually particularly telling that it was in the Romanian Cultural Institute at the time, and I was pleased to be able to really take on some of the things that Farage was talking about Romanians at the time. And once again today, I'll be particularly talking about the issues of people moving around the world, migration, refugees, as well as the big issue of the Paris climate talks. Because really, when we think about this year, on the international stage, it's a huge year. And the biggest event of the year, the one with the largest long-term consequences, bigger even than the massive attack on Greek democracy and the Greek people with the imposition by the international financial sector and its agents of further massive austerity and cuts, is the Paris climate talks. The fact is, the world is heating up. Records keep being broken month after month, year after year, and time is running out. But there are really positive signs towards Paris. Not so much perhaps the progress of the talks themselves, but the fact that China and the US are taking positive big steps forward themselves, both in their rhetoric and perhaps more importantly in their action. And the economics of renewable energy is starting to win over friends, even with people who don't really think in terms of the environment. Those people are those who, of course, don't seem to realise that our entire economy is simply a subset of the environment. Nothing exists without the natural world. But this year will be remembered for another thing too. That is, its refugee crisis. There are now more refugees in the world than there have been since the end of the Second World War. Of course, it's faded a little from the headlines now because there is finally a rescue mission, and the refugees desperately trying to cross the Mediterranean aren't dying, I'm pleased to say, in the same kind of numbers as they were a couple of months ago. But of course, they're still suffering immensely. In fear, in desperation, abused, maltreated, crammed into tiny boats, they are getting across the Med. And a lot of them, of course, come from Syria. And a lot of them also come from Eritrea, two places where no one could claim there isn't good cause to flee. People are being forced to flee. They are utterly, undeniably refugees. And yet we have in Britain still the situation, and the latest figures have just come out. The United Nations asked Britain to take its fair share of the most vulnerable Syrian refugees. No one thinks that we can resettle the entire population, almost a third of Syrians who are on the run, fleeing in one way or another. But the UN is rightly trying to focus on some of the most vulnerable. And one of these, and I mean there's so many stories, but one of the stories I had heard that just really touched my heart was the story of a single father. His wife died giving birth to triplets. He had 3 small other children as well. And he was trying to care for 6 small children in a tent in a refugee camp. Now, the neighbouring states where the vast bulk of the refugees are doing amazing things. And indeed, I'll give the British government credit for contributing quite well to helping that. But you cannot expect states straining under the sheer bulk of people with many problems of their own to be able to provide the kind of support that someone like that needs. And that's what the UN's talking about when it's talking about the most vulnerable, people with severe disabilities, severe injuries, children who've been maimed in war, people who need the kind of services that just aren't available in neighbouring states. Now, I've got some minor piece of good news for you, because David Cameron says we're going to take some more refugees. On top of that 187 that we've taken now, we're going to take another 200. To say that that is an utterly inadequate response, really, there just aren't words in the English language to describe that kind of response to the kind of humanitarian crisis that we're seeing. But of course, there's a lot more to British policy on migration than just the issues around refugees, bad as that is. And I've recently been, and will be going back soon, to the Yarlswood Immigration Detention Centre, where we're seeing hundreds of women locked up for 6 months or more. This is indefinite detention. They have no idea when they're going to get out. They're locked up in there with no certainty of their future. One woman has been there for more than 600 days. Britain is the only country in Europe that does indefinite detention of people under migration rules. These are people who've committed no crime. They're just locked up with no certainty about their future, fearing any time they might be bundled forcibly onto a plane and sent back to the place that they've fled in terror. So that's one of the other aspects of British migration policy. A third area that I wanted to focus on, and this I think is perhaps where the Commonwealth aspect most comes in and might be of interest, and indeed it's the area most likely to affect any one of you. Because in Britain now, there are, on the government's own figures, about 19,000 people, Britons, who can't live in their own country with their spouse or partner, and often with their children as well. And that's because you have to be earning more than £18,600 a year to be able to come to Britain as a Briton and bring your foreign spouse or partner with you. Half of British workers don't earn that. You go to Wales, you go to Northern England, and the percentages are much higher. And so I was actually recently at the migration event discussing this, and there was a broad range of people in the room. And they range from a man who said, and I can't really do the accent, but who said, "Well, my father was at Dunkirk, and I can't live in my own country with my wife." He wasn't perhaps a natural Green voter, I suspect, but he was horrified by the Tory government immigration policy. And again, one of the other people speaking at that event demonstrated just how incredibly short-sighted this policy is in Britain. It was the mother of a British woman who can't live in her own country with her husband because he's Turkish. So she took her rather expensive university education and her master's degree, and now she's living and working in Turkey. So Britain has been robbed of a skilled person. The whole family has been robbed of a daughter, a sister. The family isn't together. And everybody's losing out. No one's where they want to be. And I think it struck me after this event, and I was talking to a friend of mine, and it's so much the case with so many Commonwealth countries that families have moved back and forth through the generations. A friend of mine who's an IT professional, pretty well paid, very, very skilled, the sort of thing we're always being told that Britain doesn't have enough of. Her mother married a British man when he was in New Zealand. That was about 40 years ago, so her mother's been married to a British man for 40-odd years. My friend is worried that at some point her mother might need to be looked after, might need care, might need help, and yet both of the daughters of that family live in the UK. And so they're faced with the prospect that one of them may have to uproot their life and move to New Zealand to look after their mother. It used to be under old immigration rules, their mother could have moved to where her children were, here, and lived as a family as they most likely would want to do. But that option isn't available with our immigration law. So I think we've got to really ask some questions, as I'm going to refer to in terms of climate change too, about what the rest of the world can teach us. And this is where I'm coming to the point about cultural democracy. And I think I would really urge people around the world, people being affected by this, people who know people affected by this, speak up, Tell the British government, tell Britons you know about these stories. Tell them that it doesn't have to be this way. It usedn't to be this way, and we don't think this is right. Because I think the word diplomacy is interesting. We tend to always think, and I know having moved around in UN circles somewhat, there's a tendency to perhaps to think that, we're being diplomatic. We can't say the difficult things. We can't point out where you're getting things wrong. But actually, it really is terribly important, because Britons are getting a lot wrong at the moment, and it's really useful, really helpful, if the rest of the world turns round and perhaps a little bit bluntly tells us that. Which brings me on to the second focus of the talk. And I thought I really had to talk about this a little today, just given the circumstances. Now, roundabout as I'm standing here, Amber Rudd, our Energy and Climate Secretary, is going to be giving a speech on climate change. And I have to say that I actually feel a bit sorry for her, because what we've seen in recent weeks and months is a government that's pretty well trashed every policy that Britain has to tackle climate change. I really don't know what she's going to say, and I don't think anyone's going to believe, I assume, that she's going to say she really wants to fight climate change. And indeed, I'd like to go back to some words from our Prime Minister. Earlier this year, before the election, he stood with Ed Miliband and Nick Clegg and said, "Acting on climate change is also an opportunity for the UK to grow a stronger economy, which is more efficient and more resilient to the risks ahead. It's in our national interest to act and ensure others act with us." Now, the introduction made reference to my presence on the leader debates earlier. I'd really love the chance to be able to challenge David Cameron eye to eye, face to face on that, because you just look at the list of what this government has done. Just yesterday, it ended the Green Deal, which was a scheme to get homes more energy efficient, insulated, energy efficient appliances, lighting, etc. Now, that was actually a pretty poor scheme. No one really is going to mourn a scheme that saw people being offered the chance to borrow money at 6 or 7% interest, when these days you can get a mortgage for 2 or 3%, for over 20 or 30 years with a long and complicated procedure. It was designed by the finance sector for the finance sector. But nonetheless, this was the scheme the government had for energy efficiency in buildings. And I was actually not very long ago in a building rather like this one in this part of London, and I had a meeting with the Baltic and Scandinavian ambassadors, as one does. Very nice lunch. But I was talking about the issue of energy efficiency in buildings. And one of these ambassadors from one of the Scandinavian countries, on average 10, 20 degrees colder than us, certainly in winter, she said to me, I was talking about insulation, and she just reacted passionately, and again in a perhaps very undiplomatic way. It was said from the heart, "I've never been so cold as I've been in Britain." Most of the rest of Europe has housing of quite decent quality. They've insulated their homes. They've either built new homes or they've retrofitted the older houses, so they're warm and comfortable and they don't take much energy to heat. And Britain simply hasn't done that. We can claim in terms of fuel poverty that we are, in the list of Western European countries, not the worst. We're the second worst. Lithuania is worse. Apologies to anyone from Lithuania. But we've seen the Green Deal ending. We've seen end to subsidies for wind and solar. We've seen the climate change levy applied to renewable energy, which is a particularly interesting example where it was described as like making apple juice makers pay the alcohol tax, because the climate change levy was supposed to be applied to people who were emitting carbon so that the government had more money to deal with renewable energy. So again, I come back to the point that all of you, the rest of the world, needs to tell Britain, this isn't right, this is wrong. In 2008, with the Climate Change Act, Britain was really leading. Britain was an example for others to follow, and I'm sure it was inspiring for others. But now we can actually look around the world, and this may surprise you, but I'm actually rather inspired by China on climate change at the moment. Last year, new electricity generation in China, 48% was renewables. Now, there were some aspects, some questions about some of the environmental friendliness of some of that renewables, but nonetheless, there's a real commitment there. And coal consumption in China has fallen off a cliff. We've got the US, where they've actually, President Obama hasn't done everything that he should have done, but he has declared carbon dioxide a pollutant, a big political step. So there's lots of exciting, positive things happening around the world as we go towards the Paris climate talks. And what I'd say is you as the world have really got to turn around to Britain and say, what are you doing? You might only emit 2% of the world's carbon greenhouse gas emissions. But there's 2 points to make. One is the fact that a huge amount of the carbon dioxide that's up there now was emitted by Britain. The Industrial Revolution started here. We've been pumping it up for a long time. That gives us a real moral responsibility to actually act. The other point to make is that a lot of the world still focuses on Britain. There's a lot of media focus on Britain, issues around language. And so people notice what Britain's doing. And our weakness, our failures, make it harder for campaigners all around the rest of the world. So you've got a right to say to us, what are you doing, and to demand change. So I do like to allow plenty of time for questions and discussion. I do think it's a general rule of thumb that dialogue is more interesting than monologue. So hopefully I've thrown out some interesting ideas there, some thoughts, I guess, about immigration, migration policy, what are we going to do about the refugee crisis, some thoughts about climate change, the Paris talks, the key event of this year, and some thoughts about diplomacy and what we should do and shouldn't do. So I'll leave you with those. Thank you very much. Okay, well, to answer the first one, the second one first, no, I'm not religious. I'm an atheist, have been for a long time. In terms of the broader issue of the role of religion in the state of the world, that's a fairly broad question. But I think it's worth reflecting on the fact that, a lot of the efforts we see to help the refugees, the disadvantaged, there are a lot of foundations, organisations that come from a religious impulse. But I think there's something actually more fundamental than that. There was a lovely story in The Guardian, not so much what I'd call religion, but human nature, and an innate human instinct to help your fellow human beings. And indeed, we often see this in terms of wanting to help other creatures as well. But thinking about human beings, it was at the island, I think it was the island of Kos, one of the Greek islands. This is a place that's wrestling with the immense financial crisis, great fears about their own future, 50% youth unemployment, a dreadful state. But of course now, just recently, we've seen a lot of refugees who were coming into Italy and now going into Greece. And it was an island, it's a tourist island as well. And on this island, people were rescuing the refugees. People were staggering out of these tiny crowded boats, women, children, babies, old people, everybody, staggering off the boats and just collapsing exhausted on the beach. And a mixture of locals and tourists were picking them up, getting them transported however they could and helping them set up a makeshift camp. The authorities haven't got any money, haven't got any resources, haven't got the structure to work out how to do this. But the ordinary people, tourists and locals, were helping. And I think there was a lovely story. I think she was a Swedish woman. He was basically spending her holiday ferrying supplies around for the refugees. And another problem is that people face the situation where if they move the refugees, they can technically be prosecuted for trafficking. But refugees who needed medical treatment were being taken to the hospital. People who had to get somewhere else were being taken elsewhere. People actually putting themselves at risk of criminal charges to help others. So I think that's, I would say that what's underlying our human reaction, if we allow it to govern things is a human desire to help. And of course, on the other side of that, we've got a kind of demonisation of immigrants, a refusal to talk about them as people, as human beings. There was a very good study by an organisation called Media Watch, looking at how the right-wing papers in Britain talk about refugees. And they almost never talk about people. They certainly don't talk about men, women and children. They talk about the numbers, the flood. They try very hard to not make them people, because as soon as you do make them people, help the readers to identify them as people, the attitudes change. So I think, in terms of capturing a response to that, one of the things I very often say is, I believe in a caring Britain. And I believe there's very few people who would say, oh no, I don't want a caring Britain. It's something that we need to focus on, talk about, and humanise all these stories, as indeed I did by telling some of people's individual tales. I think that's how we get away from the talk of the thousands, the millions, the floods, that sort of thing, and talk about people who are trying to live their lives as best they can.
Realism and realism to attain balance or peace.
Mm-hmm. Okay, well, I guess that's a question that really deserves a whole talk in itself, but I'll just reflect on a couple of points. To start off with, that, there's very interesting questions about the words idealistic and realistic. And I'm often, indeed during the recent election campaign, and the Green Party and our policies were accused of being idealistic. Oh, you just want things to actually be really good, and you can't have that. But I'd actually say that the people who are extremely unrealistic are the people who think things can continue as they are now. If we think of the example of Britain, we're using the resources of 3 planets every year, our share of 3 planets, but we've only got 1 planet. Now, to come to the point, the point about development and types of development, I think I can really understand a great deal of cynicism, a great deal of disbelief about the kind of model of development that much of the global south has been presented with, including the Muslim world, but certainly not restricted to it. One name, a place that comes to mind, is Rana Plaza. Now, Bangladesh has been sold on the idea, a very traditional idea of development. If you start off with low-level manufacturing, garment factories, and then you can gradually start to develop more sophisticated manufacturing. You stop supporting your peasant farmers, you allow and encourage people to flood into the cities. They have a miserable time, but eventually you start to lift the average level of consumption, the average level of quality of life available to people. Of course, for more than 1,000 workers in the Rana Plaza factory collapse, anyone who doesn't know it, it was a garment factory which had been very badly built and had extra floors put on it, and the whole building collapsed with all the workers inside. And those workers had basically been forced back inside, even though everyone knew there were cracks in the walls. Now, when people see that kind of thing and are told this is development, that's what you should be striving for, when they see peasant farmers forced off the land, as we're seeing huge tracts of Africa that are being sold to the Saudis, sold to big multinational corporations who are trying to secure their food supply. And that takes away the basic food supply of the local people. I would say that the problem is we have an utterly unrealistic model of development, if you like, the Western model of development. And what we have to do is offer people hope, realistic hope, the only hope of a different kind of model of development. And that's not the big globalisation, you can be somewhere down the bottom of the tree, feeding most of your money and wealth upwards, but that you can build strong local economies, not autarky, not that you're going to make and grow everything yourself, but that you've got lots of opportunities for small farmers to flourish, for small businesses to flourish, for all kinds of different technology to be in every country in the world. And some things, fancy, very high-tech medical scanning machines, sure, there might only be 1 or 2 places those are ever made. But we need different kinds of economies, environmentally friendly economies, people-friendly economies, a different model of development. Now, that kind of model is out there, and some of the other things you need to think about, I think, when you're looking at that model of development, is we've often been told that you've got to sort of settle for huge levels of inequality in the society. I'm thinking here of India and some of the photos that I've seen of some of the Indian billionaires. And in places like Bombay, they build mansions, but because even for them the land's so valuable, it's so hard to get hold of, they build sort of 25-storey personal mansions, towering above the slums around them. And if people are told that's development and they don't like it, I don't think that's very surprising, actually. So I think the answer is to offer hope, to offer realism, to say that what we've been doing for most of the last century hasn't worked out very well economically, socially, or environmentally. We need a different kind of model, and offer people that model, and offer people that hope, and say this is the realistic future.
Isolated from criticism.
Indeed, I suppose, I don't know, when you said the governments are responsible, I'm not sure which governments you meant, but I would say if you
Commonwealth, so there's a
yeah.
Commonwealth and United Kingdom not to be so arrogant in a way.
Well, I would certainly say that we're seeing the revival of the spirit of military adventurism. We're expecting fairly soon, now we're hearing a vote on military intervention in Syria, and we're already yet again militarily interfering in Iraq. And we know that whole region, the instability, the chaos in that whole region, has a huge amount to do with the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan, our wars. And we created that mess by throwing large amounts of high explosive around. And the solution to a problem is very rarely what created the problem in the first place. And what we need to do, and I think what we need to do is think a lot. And in Britain at the moment, we're talking a lot about defence. The government has just, under a lot of pressure, agreed to spend 2% of GDP on defence, although actually there was snuck intelligence in there when no one was looking. But basically, they've agreed to lift, in real terms, military spending. But what they're not talking about is security. They're talking about defence. And I think we really need to try and get a debate going to talk about what gives us security. And actually, guns pretty well never make you more secure. They may mean you can defend yourself, but if you want long-term security, what you need is a stable place where you don't need the guns in the first place. And that means, in terms of if we think about places like Iraq and Syria, that means investing particularly in diplomacy, and British diplomacy has been slashed right back around the world, the spending on it. And that means there isn't people there on the ground to actually do things to start off with. So what we need to do is actually increase spending on diplomacy, increase spending on aid, because what makes us all safe is a stable world in which no one's going hungry, people live in secure democratic regimes. And I can't finish on this point without making a point about a state that most of the countries represented in this room have some complicity in, which is Saudi Arabia. You could probably say it's probably the world's worst, second worst human rights abusing regime. You can argue about this league table, but they're certainly right up there. They are absolutely hideous to their own and other women. They're causing dreadful chaos with intervention in Yemen, which is fast going towards being an utterly failed state. They're utterly interventionist, causing many problems in their region. We need to put pressure on the Saudis, stop subsidising British arms sales to the Saudis, and take a different approach. If you look back on the history of it, Colonel Gaddafi was our dictator at one stage. Saddam Hussein was our dictator at some stage. The Saudi royal family is in the same situation, and we all know where those ended up. Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I'm afraid I'm going to disagree with you. 75% of people held in immigration detention are eventually allowed to stay in the UK. What we have is a culture of disbelief in our immigration system. You have people who are victims of torture, women who are very often victims of rape and sexual assault, often by the authorities in the country that they've fled. They come here and they're not believed. One of the things that happens particularly with women is that if you don't declare in your first immigration interview, you don't declare everything that will be the basis of your case later, then you're told, oh, well, you haven't done the right thing, you must be lying, and your case is thrown out. Well, they have the right to appeal, but they're at a huge risk of being locked up in the first place. I mean, a judge said our fast-track immigration system broke human rights law. That's been in operation for years. We have been breaking human rights law for years. We have a situation where an independent report said healthcare in Yarlswood was utterly inappropriate and deeply dangerous. We have mental health issues eventually affect most people if they stay there long enough. It's that vicious an environment. It's an extremely nasty situation that is an absolute disgrace. And I will very proudly next month be going to another demonstration outside Yarlswood demanding this be closed down. And one of the other points about this and the other immigration centres is they're privatised, they're outsourced, so they're run by private companies. Serco was seen to have failed at Yarlswood, so then they went to G4S. These are companies that have a long trail of human rights abuses attached to them, security companies. And because they're private, they don't come under the same kind of scrutiny as state organisations can. So one of the things I'd say to all of you, wherever you come from in the world, privatisation, I hope, has hit its maximum. It's a disastrous policy, but particularly resist any privatisation of the coercive power of the state. You have privatisation of police, of military, of jails. You lose control of that coercive power of the state, and that's an extremely dangerous situation to be in.